You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
And you get people like John Adams who will crow about what a superior society Massachusetts is. And he will tell anybody who's willing to stop and listen to him about this. That includes Thomas Jefferson, who says Massachusetts really would be wonderful if it didn't think itself better than everybody else. He'll tell King George III, everybody. He is a real Massachusetts booster. There were no Red Sox back then, but he would have worn a Red Sox hat if they had been around, right?
Hello, and welcome to episode 384 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Article 4, Section 3 of the United States Constitution establishes guidelines by which the United States Congress can admit new states to the Union. The Constitution states that, quote, "New states may be admitted by Congress into this Union, but no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states, or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress," end quote. 5 of the United States' 50 states were formed out of existing states. Vermont was formed out of territory claimed by both New Hampshire and New York. The boundaries of Tennessee were once the boundaries of North Carolina. Kentucky and West Virginia once formed parts of Virginia, and Maine was once a part of Massachusetts. Joshua Smith, an award-winning author, curator, and professor, joins us to discuss the early history of Maine and Maine's journey to independent statehood. Using details from his book, Making Maine, Statehood and the War of 1812, Josh reveals Maine's early history and how this territory became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the benefits and challenges Mainers faced as residents of Massachusetts' northern and eastern districts, and how the War of 1812 grew the momentum for Mainers' calls for independent statehood. But first, thank you for listening to Ben Franklin's World and for sharing all of your episode requests with me. This episode is the result of requests for an episode about early Maine history. And all of your requests help keep the show vibrant with different topics. So please, don't be afraid to reach out and let me know what areas of early American history that you'd like to investigate more. My email is liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Okay, are you ready to explore early Maine and see how this Massachusetts territory became an independent state? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is an award-winning author, curator, and professor. He's the interim director of the American Merchant Marine Museum in Kings Point, New York. He's also the author of the book, Making Maine, Statehood and the War of 1812, which chronicles the War of 1812 in the American Northeast and Maine's journey to statehood. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Joshua Smith.
Hey, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Joshua, your book, Making Maine, charts Maine's journey to statehood and the role that the War of 1812 played in that journey. What inspired you to delve into this topic? What inspired you about Maine's statehood journey?
I'm from Massachusetts, and I've lived a lot in Maine, so it's a regional interest, but also in the 1990s, when I was a young guy and thinking about going to grad school, there were these 2 hugely influential books about Maine in the early republic that came out. And the first was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's A Midwife's Tale, which documents in great detail this midwife in Augusta, Maine. Fantastic book. Set my hair on fire. I was just so excited to read this very detailed account of day-to-day life of this midwife. And the other book that came out about the same time is Alan Taylor's Liberty Men and Great Proprietors, set in roughly the same geographic area of Maine, where he details these agrarian squatters who had this vision of the American Revolution that was very much at odds with wealthy elites who were land speculators, and there were rebellions and riots and all that stuff. And he dug in and he found all these details. Again, set my head on fire. I'm like, so much there to be discovered in Maine history. So I decided I had to jump in because I was living in a place called Castine, Maine at the time, and there are all these ruins of fortifications dating to the War of 1812. And Ulrich and Taylor were sort of focusing on inland Maine, and I realized there were all these stories from coastal Maine, which was an equally disorderly place, and a lot of smuggling and illicit trade and spies and enemy occupation during the War of 1812. So it took me 30 years, but I produced this little book about Maine and the War of 1812 and ultimately statehood. So those things got me interested, and I also got my PhD in American and Canadian history. So the War of 1812 is a great moment to study that interaction of Canada and the United States and try to figure that out, which is particularly pertinent for the great state of Maine, which is this geographic oddity. It's the only state that connects to only one other state. It sort of thrusts up into Canada, and there are these cross-border influences, and intellectually, that's very interesting stuff.
Studying American and Canadian history while researching Maine must have led you to some interesting conclusions about who won the War of 1812, because we know that's a perennial debate, where our friends to the northward in Canada like to claim that it was they, the Canadians, and the British who won the war, while we in the United States like to claim that it was we, the Americans, who won the war.
Yeah, and certainly living in Ottawa, Canadians would tell you that they won the War of 1812, not even the British, and that they burned Washington, which isn't accurate. There were probably more West Indians in British service at the burning of Washington than there were people from British North America, as Canada was known then. So I think what you have to do with the War of 1812 is break it down, say there were many wars of 1812, and that could be with Native Americans, or it could be, the American invasion of Lower Canada from New York. And then there's this New England element, which is very different because New England threatens to secede from the United States. They're so disgusted with the war, and the governor of Massachusetts is actually sending secret envoys to the British governor of Nova Scotia saying, hey, we're thinking about an unamicable divorce with the United States, and would you guys be willing to support us if we did split from the United States? So it's a very complicated conflict. Very hard for the United States to say they won it because the U.S. Capitol is burned, at least all the public buildings are, and our economy was destroyed. And how do you square that circle? You can say, well, the United States sort of lost the war, but it won the peace. And you get into the treaties that ended the war.
Well, we're certainly going to dig into the War of 1812, but before we do, I wonder if we could dig into the history of early Maine, because something to know about the history of Maine is that until 1820, Maine was actually part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and later the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So Josh, would you tell us how Maine came to be part of Massachusetts? Because if we think of our geographical maps of the United States, right, we're picturing them in our minds. There is my childhood state of New Hampshire that breaks up any sort of contiguous geographical relationship between Maine and Massachusetts.
It basically goes back to the 17th century. There are a handful of white settlements in what we now call Maine. New Hampshire was a very small and struggling colony, but there's this much bigger colony called Massachusetts Bay, which militarily is quite aggressive geographically. It takes over the old colony, which is Plymouth, essentially, in Cape Cod. It somehow assumes control of Martha's Vineyard in Nantucket. The poor settlers in Maine are afraid of Native American attack, and settlements are getting burned. New Hampshire doesn't offer any help because they're in the same situation, so they get Massachusetts to step in, and Massachusetts is glad to do so, but there's a hook. Yes, we're going to rescue you, but now you're part of us. And Maine gets subsumed into the eastern counties of Massachusetts, and that's how it ends up being part of what later becomes the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And geographically, it's interesting because Massachusetts is quite an unhappy place after the American Revolution. There's an event in what's then called Western Mass around Worcester called Shays's Rebellion. And one of the demands of these rebels who don't like high taxes and things going on there is that Worcester becomes the capital city of Massachusetts. Now, this is a pretty reasonable demand in the context of the Revolution because virtually every former colony moves its capital city in true democratic fashion to someplace that is more central. So, for example, Albany, New York becomes the political capital, or Hartford, Connecticut, again, right dead in the center. When these rebels make this demand about making Worcester the capital, the elites in Boston are able to say, well, no, we can't do that because that wouldn't be fair to those poor people in Maine. Because if you throw Maine into the mix in Massachusetts as a state, then Boston is more central because it's equidistant for people from Maine as people from, say, Springfield, Massachusetts, or something like that. So those geographic questions are interesting, but also those elites in Boston play some games. And the primary character here is a fellow you might have heard of called John Adams, right? Or the second president of the United States. And also the man who is primarily responsible for the state constitution of Massachusetts that's still in operation today, which is the Constitution of 1780. And Adams largely writes this. But Adams is definitely one of those Boston-centric people. So there's a lower house in Massachusetts where every town can send representatives, but people tend not to because the town has to pay for those representatives and it's expensive, and especially if you're from a poor community. So towns around Boston tend to dominate the lower house. And then the upper house, the Senate, is even worse because those representatives are not apportioned just two to a county or something like that. They're actually apportioned by the amount of wealth in each county. So Suffolk County, Massachusetts, is going to have a lot of senators because that's Boston and right there, right? Whereas Washington County, Maine, up on the border with British North America, very poor, very distant. They're going to have virtually no say in the Senate. So the Massachusetts Constitution is rigged, essentially, to make sure that Boston is, we'll call it, the hub of the universe. That's a little anachronistic for this period.
I'm not 100% sure it is anachronistic, Josh, because Boston's nickname, its actual nickname in New England, is the hub. And if you grow up in the region, then you know the hub is the center of the universe.
Yes, there's a little brass disc in Boston that has the exact location. This is the axle on which the universe spins.
Now, one of the interesting things about early American capital cities is that if you look at all the previous colonies turned states, almost all of the states move their capitals inland. And I know from my research on Albany, New York, the decision to move inland from coastal port towns wasn't just about democratic fairness. Actually, in the case of New York, democratic fairness didn't factor into any of the debates about where to move the capital. For New York, and as well as for other states, it was really all about economics. Economics was the driving factor in moving these capitals. Because in the case of New York, it was too expensive for New York's government to continue to meet in New York City. We know New York has high prices. It's been the same throughout history. But especially after the British government moves out and the state has to foot that bill, that's not a bill that they want to pay to house their government in New York City. Plus, as you said, Josh, having capitals on coastal towns as states expand west, as New York State is expanding into the regions we now know as Western and Central and the Southern tier of New York, it made sense to move the capital to Albany. And people at the time argued that it was Albany's location on the Hudson River, 150 miles north of New York City, and its presence 7 miles below the east-west facing Mohawk River. So if you do live in one of these Western regions, you could use river travel and portages to get to the capital city. So it was far cheaper and far easier for everybody to meet in Albany. So when you look at New York and other early states, it really is kind of curious that Massachusetts is the one state that does not move its capital from Boston, that port town, to a cheaper, more inland place like Worcester or even Springfield. But the lack of the move does make sense the way that you just explained it, Josh, about how the politics of early Massachusetts worked. So I wonder if you would tell us how Massachusetts was able to govern its eastern and northern counties in Maine. Because today we have the internet, we have cars, we have trains, we can get to places with fast speeds and communication. But in the colonial and early republic periods, there weren't even really any good roads. So it would have taken people from Maine, not just the cost of traveling, but a lot of time to travel from Maine to Massachusetts, unless they were coming from a port town and went by water. So could you tell us about that relationship, the government relationship between Maine and Massachusetts?
Well, they do because they've invested heavily in Maine public lands as speculators. So they want to make a lot of money off of Maine. Ha ha, joke's on them. Nobody's ever made a lot of money off of Maine. So Massachusetts has too many children. Everybody's having lots and lots of babies after the revolution. There's no land for them. So people naturally turn to Maine, which is largely a howling wilderness and lots of land there. And so there's a lot of people moving there. And Massachusetts, it's a standard, well, there are just counties in Maine. And there's a growing number of counties as more people move up there. They split up by more counties. But the interesting thing about Massachusetts is that it has this very strong sense of identity, and it tries to impose that, transfer that from the area around Boston to the Maine wilderness without a whole lot of luck. And I call this the Massachusetts ideal, and you get people like John Adams who will crow about what a superior society Massachusetts is. And he will tell anybody who's willing to stop and listen to him about this. That includes Thomas Jefferson, who says Massachusetts really would be wonderful if it didn't think itself better than everybody else. He'll tell King George III, everybody. He is a real Massachusetts booster. There were no Red Sox back then, but he would have worn a Red Sox hat if they had been around, right? So this Massachusetts ideal hinges on a couple of things, of institutions really, and part of that is education. And that could include Harvard University, which is a conservative, you could even say reactionary institution at the time, or Massachusetts helped set up the first college in Maine, which is Bowdoin College. And just as a reminder of what Bowdoin is for, is to produce useful citizens for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, its first and oldest building is Massachusetts Hall. So education is part of it. Religion is part of it. Massachusetts had an official state religion. That is not forbidden by the Constitution, which only applies to the federal government. There are actually a couple of states that have churches supported with taxpayer dollars. Briefly, Virginia, Connecticut, and in Massachusetts, it's the Congregational Church. And it has this very orderly vision of society where you are going to show deference to your social superiors. You're going to have to support these probably Harvard-trained ministers who are very expensive, and they are telling you how to think. And that had been a big impact in the American Revolution, where congregational ministers had used the pulpit to argue for supporting the American Revolution. So these ministers are partly political, and they are trying to convince people to live a Massachusetts-approved lifestyle. It doesn't really work in Maine. It's too expensive. They don't really trust people from Boston, and you get these evangelical churches rising up, some of which have roots in the maritime provinces of what is now Canada, and these are not heavily based on the written word. There aren't a whole lot of rules. They're meeting in fields or on beaches and doing full immersion baptism for adults and things like that, that alarm the people in Boston and the Congregationalists who send missionaries, literally call them missionaries, to Maine to try and impose this religious vision. And there are other institutions as well, such as the militia, the courts, which are packed with mostly lawyers who had moved out of Massachusetts because there were no jobs for them there. And the big tussle in Maine is that you do have these, especially interior Maine, you've got these agrarian squatters who think the revolution means they get free land versus these very wealthy speculators based in Boston who say, no, actually, I bought 10,000 acres from the Commonwealth, and you can't stay on that land unless you pay me probably a grossly inflated price. And again, the system is fixed in that land speculators only have to pay 1/5 the price in taxes that the squatters have to pay to the state every year. So they've got a really good setup and are deeply resented. And there are riots, and even a surveyor working for these speculators is murdered in the woods of Maine, and there's a trial, and it all gets very ugly. So there's this tension between Maine and Massachusetts, and it's clear that Maine is sort of drifting away. And one of the ways it does that is that old Massachusetts is solidly federalist. They've got this very stable vision of American society, which is going to be based on trade and agriculture, and there will be a superior class who will rule and going to have good trade relations with Britain, and essentially that the little people should know their place. Well, that doesn't really work so well in rural Maine, and it wouldn't to this day. And so the response of people in Maine is to join the other major political movement, which we'll call Jeffersonianism, because the name sort of changes a bit, which is more about egalitarian ideals, not about elites, not about state religion or regional identities. It's in some ways a much more national vision of the country. And these are led initially by a guy named Henry Dearborn, who lives on the Kennebec River, originally from New Hampshire, had gone through Maine in Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec in the American Revolution. And he gets elected to Congress in the 1790s, and surprise, surprise, he becomes very good friends with Thomas Jefferson, who relies on Dearborn for military advice. And Henry Dearborn will actually become Jefferson's Secretary of War, roughly equivalent to the Secretary of Defense these days. And he serves all 8 years, the entire Jefferson administration, and then will serve in the War of 1812 as the highest ranked Army general in the entire Army, by which time he's pretty old, he's pretty overweight, and he's not very effective, frankly. But he's a big influence in Maine. He lived on the Kennebec River, and he will influence the Jeffersonians in Maine, and I think encourages the statehood movement.
It's really curious, as you point out, that Massachusetts, and not just Massachusetts, but Connecticut in particular, were some of the most religious colonies in early states in the Union. And today, New England has this reputation as being a place that champions religious freedom and is a place that is known as being one of the most secular regions in the United States. And yet, this was a region that was probably among the most religiously conservative areas in the entire early republic, at least until the 1830s. Until the 1830s, you had to pay a tithe in Massachusetts and Connecticut by law to your local Congregationalist church to help pay the minister and get those messages about the Congregationalist way of life.
Right. And there's this unity of religion and politics, and you can see that in this funny New England word, meeting house, which was both a church and where you had town meetings and conducted town business in the same structure. That way you didn't have to pay for a separate church building, for starters. But it shows you there is definitely this link between politics and religion in Massachusetts, which leaves 21st century Americans quite uncomfortable.
Josh, would you tell us about Maine's involvement in the American Revolution and the role it played as a very strategic territory during the Revolution?
So Maine does play a big role in the American Revolution, largely as a part of Massachusetts. But it's a rough war for Maine. The British Navy, the Royal Navy, burns what we would now call Portland, burns it flat and causes a lot of devastation up there. But probably more importantly, the British occupy a place called Castine, close to the Penobscot River, and they will hold that for the rest of the war. Now, Massachusetts tries to eject the British from Castine. They send up a large expedition of militia and ships, so it's both a fleet and an army. Paul Revere is one of the leaders of this effort. They get to Castine and they besiege the British, but then a Royal Navy fleet comes up behind them and traps the entire American fleet, which is either scuttled by the Americans or captured by the British. It's one of the largest American naval defeats in history. And the militia, including Paul Revere, end up walking through the Maine woods all the way back to Massachusetts. The problem for Massachusetts with this is not only is it a military defeat and they've lost control of eastern Maine, but it is on the hook financially for this entire expedition. And Massachusetts went deeply into debt over this expedition, and they're going to spend years and years trying to pay for this. And in fact, part of the deal to get Massachusetts to sign into the U.S. Constitution in 1789 is that the new national government will assume the Revolutionary War debt of Massachusetts. The other thing that happens with Maine in the Revolution is at the end of the war, the British have to evacuate Castine in eastern Maine. And those loyalists who were there, along with loyalists from places like New York City, end up settling on the Bay of Fundy just east of Maine. And they found a new British colony called New Brunswick. It is a specifically loyalist colony. So here you have Maine, favored the Revolution, cheek and jowl with this loyalist colony. And you would think there'd be a lot of animosity there. But oddly enough, they bury the hatchet pretty quickly, and they establish trade relations, which very often is of a form of smuggling. I'll give you an example. The last time Benedict Arnold ever stepped foot in the United States was in what's now Eastport, Maine, because he was living in New Brunswick, and he was a timber trader, and he was doing some trade with Eastport, then in Massachusetts. And some of his veterans saw him there. And you got to remember, Benedict Arnold was an incredibly dynamic and charismatic leader. And they see this guy who'd become a trader. And these Continental veterans will sort of just sit down and start bawling, crying. They're deeply conflicted and upset. But they don't assault him. But there's a lot of emotion there.
So what was Maine like after the United States achieved its independence? You told us a little bit about the politics of Maine after the Revolution. But what did this region physically look like? Where was the population centered? And what was its economy like? Did Mainers have to do a lot of rebuilding after the War for Independence, like Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, and other states that had been occupied had to do?
So Maine's pretty devastated, but old Massachusetts has too many people. So Maine is growing by leaps and bounds because of people coming from the rest of New England, but especially Massachusetts. Places where they'd cut down all their trees, like Cape Cod. Those people moved to Maine. And then they proceed to have lots and lots of babies. So what is Maine like? It's very young, for starters. And these people want land. They want to become farmers, or they're cutting down trees for the timber industry. So it's growing by leaps and bounds is what it's like. But they're also developing a society that is not necessarily in accord with those Massachusetts ideals. So they become very evangelical in their religion, which works for their environment a lot better than Congregationalism would. And there's less deference in Maine. So they're not necessarily crazy about those wealthy people in Boston. They are not bowing and doing what they want. And in fact, Maine people developed this reputation in old Massachusetts. One person writing about Maine people describes them as a people naturally bad and violent. So there are tensions growing between old Massachusetts and Maine. They're looking at the world fundamentally differently, and that's largely because of these land issues and egalitarian ideals that the Mainers have versus those Massachusetts elites in Boston.
So Maine is a young place after the Revolution. It's an ever-expanding place, and a place that's really developing political and religious and other worldviews and outlooks. They're conflicting with those of old Massachusetts. And while these outlooks are conflicting with each other, the War of 1812 comes along. Josh, we need to take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, and then after that moment of thanks, let's dive into the War of 1812 and Maine's statehood movement. On June 19, Americans will celebrate Juneteenth, a national holiday that commemorates and celebrates the end of slavery in the United States. My colleagues and I at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation invite you to come spend Juneteenth with us. Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth celebration will be spread over 3 days this year, from Sunday, June 16 through Wednesday, June 19. We have lots of great programs and events planned that commemorate emancipation through themes of family, resilience, achievement, and spirituality. Master blacksmith Darrell Reeves and his apprentice Karina Rocca will be giving talks and working in the Colonial Williamsburg blacksmith shop, demonstrating 18th and 19th century traditions of African-American ironwork. Acclaimed storyteller Sheila Arnold will help us embrace the power of hope, resilience, and the unyielding desire for freedom in a couple of different programs, including Permission to be Free, a Juneteenth story. and the world-renowned poet Nikki Giovanni will speak at Colonial Williamsburg's annual Juneteenth sunrise service. Plus, my colleagues throughout our art museums and historic area will offer special tours, performances, and programs. So please, come to Williamsburg and join us. Visit colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth for a complete list of Colonial Williamsburg's Juneteenth festivities and how you can plan your visit. That's colonialwilliamsburg.org/Juneteenth. And if you do come to Williamsburg, let me know you're coming, because the Innovation Studios team and I will be walking around the historic area supporting and enjoying these great programs. Some historians have referred to the War of 1812 as the United States' second war for independence. This was a war that had several causes, most amounting to the fact that the United States, in different ways, felt that Great Britain was violating its independence and the Treaty of Paris in 1783. For example, the British refused to evacuate the United States' western posts in the Great Lakes region, and Americans viewed the British as interfering with their diplomacy, both their domestic diplomacy and their international diplomacy. On the domestic side, they viewed the British as trying to incite indigenous peoples against them. On the international side, Americans viewed the British as interfering with their ability to conduct free trade. This was the period of the Napoleonic Wars. One of the United States' big trading partners was France. Great Britain did not want American produce going to France, so it created a policy whereby the British Navy would seize American vessels, impress their sailors, and take their cargoes to where they were needed throughout the empire. So Josh, the War of 1812 was a time that really divided Americans. Many Americans thought that the United States should have avoided war with Great Britain. Others thought they should be in this war and fighting with Great Britain to resolve these issues. Would you tell us how Mainers specifically viewed Great Britain by 1812 and what they thought about the United States going to war against Great Britain?
Maine's economy is actually flourishing at this time because of the timber trade largely with Britain. And Maine essentially became an economic outpost of Britain. There are a lot of lovely coastal towns with big mansions built in this period. That's because they were selling trees to the British, transatlantic, building Liverpool and all those early industrial cities in England. So this makes Maine different from the rest of the nation. Maine's economy is largely an export economy, and it's exporting trees to Britain, which puts it in a very difficult position because the federal government is having these diplomatic tiffs with the British, and sometimes they're about impressment or Native Americans or other things. But this sort of comes to a head in 1807 when a British warship stops an American frigate, the Chesapeake, and fires into it and removes some deserters who had enlisted into the U.S. Navy. And this ends up in what we call Jefferson's embargo, because Jefferson figures out, well, that's really an act of war, but the United States is completely unprepared for war with Britain. So instead, let's try to completely stop trade with Britain to punish it for interfering with the United States. This will be very hard on the District of Maine because its economy essentially was British. But many people in Maine are Jeffersonians, and they tighten their belts and they try to hold on for a few months. But as this drags on, it becomes clear that Jefferson's not going to stop. And if you're looking at your starving children, and there were apparently people who did starve to death, because what happens in Maine is the entire credit nexus collapses. You can't get credit, and Maine is unusual in that it is not food independent. It has to import things like flour from Chesapeake Bay. So if there's no maritime trade and no credit, by the end of the winter, the larder is bare. How do you get money? How do you do this? And the answer is you begin trading with the British anyways. So it's a weird sort of smuggling trade, and that's not smuggling in, it's smuggling out. Jefferson responds quite harshly to this by stationing American naval vessels on the coast of Maine and building little forts at the entrance to Maine harbors. And both the naval vessels and the forts will fire on ships when they defy the embargo and put to sea anyways. And then Jefferson does something very interesting. He attempts to directly order the Massachusetts militia to enforce the embargo. And he bypasses the governor of Massachusetts in doing this. And This causes deep resentment in Massachusetts. There are militiamen who refuse to serve because they understand they may be called on to shoot on their neighbors, essentially. And there's a huge collapse of confidence in the militia. And the embargo pretty much collapses in Maine, and ships end up, by the end of the embargo, they're just coming and going anyways. And Jefferson actually has to rescind the embargo just 2 days before he leaves office in 1809. So there will continue to be these diplomatic problems, and the federal government will continue to tinker with maritime trade to try and punish the British. And this just makes people in Maine very unhappy. And what it means is that by 1808, in local elections, the Federalists regain power in Maine, essentially. And for the first time, the Jeffersonians, who've been growing at a good clip, are stopped. And it sort of turns neighbor on neighbor. So Maine between 1807 and 1812, a very unhappy place. Politics are becoming more partisan. There are awful events where people get shot or tarred and feathered over maritime trade issues. So neighbors are eyeing neighbors in a very unhappy way. And usually this comes out in town meetings where the town comes together. And one of the oddities of New England town governance is that town meetings will make these grand pronouncements about, federal policy or, Napoleon or whatever. And you'll see if one town is saying nice things about Jefferson, almost for sure the town across the river is saying bad things about him. And of course, the governor of Massachusetts leading up to the War of 1812 is this guy, Elbridge Gerry, after whom the gerrymander is named. So people are fiddling with the electoral systems in very unpleasant ways, and that makes people upset too. So Maine is a very riled up place. When the war finally breaks, it's just yet more bad news, and it further divides Maine communities.
As you mentioned, Josh, the War of 1812 didn't really commence until June 18, 1812, which was when the United States issued a declaration of war against Great Britain. How did the residents of Maine experience the War of 1812? Before the war, it's an unhappy place. Did it continue to be an unhappy place during the war?
Well, it's a horrible experience. Because of the war and a British blockade, again, it's very hard to get food. There are families that are starving to death. Taxation more than quadruples to pay for the war, and that's bitterly resented. A lot of people, having learned during the embargo and after that you can evade federal regulations and regulators, decide to trade with the British anyways, and that's now trade with the enemy. At one point, a fifth of all the ships entering Bermuda, which is a British colony, are actually from Maine. And certainly a lot of the trade with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick continues with inflated war prices. So there's even more incentive to trade with the enemy and smuggle. There are spies floating around, British and American. There are big conventions where people either are for the war or against the war. There are fistfights and brawls. And there's this funny situation, which is probably the more important point here, where Massachusetts absolutely opposed this war, including all the congregational ministers. So Massachusetts is very against the war, and those people are Federalists politically. In Maine, there are fewer Federalists, and the Jeffersonians up in Maine again find themselves in this awkward spot where they want to support the war even though it's against their economic interests to do so, but they're trying to be good Jeffersonians. Massachusetts and the United States disagree about who can order out the militia, and Massachusetts blocks the United States government from activating a lot of its militia for fear that those troops will be marched to Canada to engage in the invasion of Canada, which is basically the United States war plan was. So there's a lot of unhappiness and tension there. There are some Jeffersonians in Boston who think that the Federalists are going to use the militia to seize control of Boston and take control of the federal forts there, and a lot of paranoia. So the federal government creates, in Maine and other places too, but in Maine it's a little different. They create a new kind of force that's neither the regular army nor is it the militia. These are people called U.S. volunteers. And they're supposed to stay in Maine to defend Maine. And that's the official story from Washington. But local Jeffersonians, who are the officers of these units, because they're all appointed by President Madison with the help of Henry Dearborn, who's now the highest ranked general in the U.S. Army, local people sort of subvert the purpose of these units, not just to defend against the British, but actually to cow down the Federalist opposition to the war. And that could be by unofficially beating up Federalists in the streets. It could be by intercepting those who are trying to engage in illicit trade with Quebec or New Brunswick. It could be by trying to intimidate the local militia. So there's this real sense in Maine and in Boston that these volunteers are a politicized military force being used to impose President Madison's will on the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And it infuriates Massachusetts, which does have an inflated idea of its own importance. And it leads to sometimes confrontation between state-controlled militia and federally controlled volunteers where they almost fire at each other. They always step back at the last minute, but there are military riots, as they're referred to, or jails get stormed by people. So it's ugly. It's very, very tense. And it only gets worse when in 1814 the British again invade eastern Maine and again occupy Castine and rebuild the fortifications there and brushed aside any opposition with very little effort. And this leaves the question of Massachusetts. Are they going to try to repeat the American Revolutionary experience and have a Massachusetts expedition that is going to go up there and eject the British? And the Federalist elite in Boston said, no, we did not do so well in the Revolution, so we're not going to repeat that. And indeed, they find that it's actually the responsibility of the federal government to do it. But the federal government is broke. It has very big problems recruiting. Its military really does not perform very well during the War of 1812. And so they talk about trying to push the British out of eastern Maine, but it's just talk, because at the end of the day, the federal government is broke. It has no money, and it can't really rely on Massachusetts to support it. In fact, Massachusetts is doing everything it can to undermine the federal government. After the British invade Maine, Massachusetts calls for the New England states to gather Hartford, Connecticut, and the big fear is that they are going to call for the secession of the New England states from the United States and cause a civil war. And indeed, the governor of Massachusetts is at this time sending secret envoys to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and negotiating with the British, will you support New England if it rebels against the United States? They don't want troops because they know the presence of redcoats would be too inflammatory, but they want financial assistance, they want weapons. And so that's the big threat. And it causes a lot of tension and a near civil war situation in Maine, with Federalist communities saying, we must arm ourselves to protect ourselves from the Jeffersonians, and the Jeffersonians saying the same thing about the Federalists. So it's a miserable situation. Families starving, high taxation, disease is stalking the district, and then these very unhappy political conversations and threats of civil war. So a deeply unhappy place.
I'm really glad you brought up the Hartford Convention and shed some light on just how opposed to the War of 1812 most of the New England states were. And it does seem like Maine is opposed and kind of out of step with the rest of the New English region, because it does have those economic ties to Great Britain and to Canada, and it is politically opposed to the ideas that are coming out of Boston and Massachusetts. Did Maine ever consider leaving Massachusetts and joining Canada as a new province?
No, not really. So Maine finds itself in this funny situation where Massachusetts refuses to help it, and the U.S. government can't. So it's about Christmas time in 1814 where a bunch of primarily Jeffersonians get together in Portland, Maine, and they say, look, Massachusetts is essentially committing treason. We should no longer be associated with them. And furthermore, since the federal government is so weak, we think we should become a state so that we have better representation in Washington and our interests, rather than Boston's interests, will get conveyed to Congress. So again, this is part of that almost a civil war with Maine wants to secede from Massachusetts and Massachusetts wants to secede from the United States. Complex stuff.
It really is complex stuff. So would you tell us more about Maine's movement towards statehood? In your book, Making Maine, you make the point that you just made, which is that the statehood movement in Maine gained momentum during the War of 1812. But what was the progression to actual statehood like from Maine, from this movement that really gains momentum in the War of 1812 to when Maine actually becomes a state in 1820?
Maine, as early as the 1790s, is making noises about becoming a state. And Massachusetts is actually quite reasonable about this. General Court, as it's called in Massachusetts, will say, okay, well, if you have a vote and it's X number of people, X percentage, sure, you can become a state. And the Mainers never really get it together. By the early 19th century, the Maine statehood movement is becoming increasingly associated with the district's Jeffersonians under the leadership of a brilliant guy named William King, who goes on this big drive for decades to get Maine independence. And he's willing to talk to these agrarian squatters. And he makes fairly extravagant promises to them, and he manages to get their votes. Now, somehow the promises never really come through, but he is leading the statehood movement. He is a general in the Massachusetts militia, so he does have to respond to Boston in that sense. And ironically, and I think this shows what a complex man he was, he's also, throughout the War of 1812, trading quite extensively with the British. So he is a smuggler on quite a grand scale, and it's sort of an open secret because he'd been doing the same thing during Jefferson's embargo. So here he is, at one level being a very good Jeffersonian and supporting the war. He tries, to the extent possible, to be a good citizen of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and be an effective militia general. Yet at the same time, he's selling everybody out by engaging in trade with the enemy. And luckily, his papers are extensive and are all at the Maine Historical Society up in Portland, Maine.
And what did Massachusetts and Bay Staters make of Maine's movement towards statehood, especially after the War of 1812?
They're quite dismissive of it. John Adams especially thinks it's a terrible idea and that Maine will sink into mediocrity. So they look down on people from Maine. However, they're willing to entertain and be reasonable, and say if you can get the votes together to do this. This becomes more complex after the War of 1812, when in old Massachusetts, there's only a very tiny Jeffersonian party and a lot of Federalists. And it's a funny situation because all of the Jeffersonians, most of the Jeffersonians in the Commonwealth, live in Maine. And it turns out that the Jeffersonians in old Massachusetts are unwilling to let Maine Jeffersonians run the state party. They're just too hung up on Massachusetts and its superiority to Maine. So they won't have it. They would rather live under Federalist rule than have Maine Jeffersonians tell them what to do. Ironically, the Federalist Party in old Massachusetts will end up being kind of supportive of Maine's statehood for this very interesting reason that all the Jeffersonians are in Maine. And if old Massachusetts can jettison the District of Maine with all its Jeffersonians, their plan is Massachusetts will be Federalist forever. The idea is they're going to purify old Massachusetts by getting rid of those troublesome Mainers.
Maine finally achieved its statehood during the Missouri Compromise in 1820. And if you'll recall, the Missouri Compromise was a big deal because it kept the number of free states and slave states in the United States Union even. Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, and Maine joined the Union as a free state. Josh, what happened after Maine finally obtained its independence from old Massachusetts? How did statehood impact Mainers' way of life? And what did statehood mean for Maine's standing within New England? Because now this region is actually composed not of 5 states, but 6 states, What was the dynamic of the region like with this new change in statehood status for Maine?
So the Missouri Compromise is interesting because initially Massachusetts has arranged for Maine to have a vote on independence, which Maine actually does pass in 1819. And the deal is, okay, Maine will become a state if Congress agrees by March of 1820. And so it's purely a New England deal, and Congress is going to rubber stamp it, no problem. And then this troublesome place called Missouri enters the scene, and Missouri people say, we want to be a state too. And people are starting now to do the calculus of congressional representation for free states like New England with no slavery versus slaveholding states like Missouri. And so it becomes a political football. And I think one of the disappointing things about this is it's very clear that several of the Maine politicians who are working for Maine statehood are quite willing to see slavery thrive in Missouri so long as they get statehood, because they see profitable offices in a new state government in Maine. So some of Maine founders, sadly, end up being sort of pro-slavery, to the great disappointment of a lot of the anti-slavery people. So it's kind of sordid. Now, this is a bitter debate in Congress. It goes down to the wire, and I think with a couple hours left, Congress finally does hash out this Missouri Compromise so that there's a balance. Maine enters as free, Missouri enters as a slave state. Maine's first governor will be William King, the guy who had fought for Maine statehood for so long. He's governor for just over a year. He finds it's a whole lot more fun to be the rebel and try to tweak those people in Boston than it is actually to try to rule these fractious Mainers. And here's the irony. He leaves office, he resigns, because he tries to follow Massachusetts state policies, which have active governance, willing to use state tax money to sponsor industrial development. And he tries to do the same thing in Maine, and farmers, those squatters, are like, heck no. If I'm paying for it out of my taxes, no. And when that vote happens, he leaves just after there were one-year terms back then. So he gets reelected once, then very shortly after that, leaves office. And I think the ironic thing about Maine statehood, which gets so fractious, so complicated, and they finally get statehood, and in a lot of ways, John Adams is right. Maine does not become a center of excellence. It doesn't even really separate itself from Massachusetts' identity. For example, Massachusetts celebrates this holiday in April called Patriots' Day. The only other state that celebrates that would be the great state of Maine. If you look at Maine's state house in its capital in Augusta, it is a miniature copy of the state house in Boston.
Does Maine also have a pine cone on top of its dome? Massachusetts does, but that's to symbolize Maine.
Yes. So Maine can't quite get over that connection to Massachusetts. And that ambivalence persists to this day in both directions. So people in Massachusetts will call people in Maine are all a bunch of hicks, yet they own summer homes on a lake or on the coast. Or Mainers will wear a Boston Red Sox hat and with no irony whatsoever decry those stupid people in Boston. So in my mind, Maine never does fully separate. It's sort of like this halfway divorce. Maine tends to follow Boston signals in terms of social change. Maine leads the nation after statehood in two ways. Maine found some of the leading pacifist societies in the nation after the War of 1812, and the American Pacifist Society still exists to this day. And the other thing that Maine leads in is the temperance movement against hard alcohol, and temperance laws in many states were often referred to as Maine laws. But that's sort of it in terms of national influence. Maine's poet extraordinaire Longfellow moves from Portland to Cambridge, and then you can see that Maine is an isolated place. It's not very well connected to the rest of the nation. After the Civil War, it becomes known as a great place to be from, but not a great place to be at, and people drain out and go west. And then economically, all times are hard times in Maine, I like to say. It is not a wealthy place. Lately, it's doing better because of COVID, because people decided a great place to hide from COVID would be Maine.
I've also read that Maine is the most honest state in the United States. I have no idea how that was calculated, but I could believe that about Maine, that it's a very honest place.
Isn't that exactly what a liar would say?
Josh, before we move into the time warp, why do you think it's important that we know about Maine's journey to statehood? How do you think knowing this story can help us better understand early American history?
I think because we don't have a very good understanding of the War of 1812 and what a massively unhappy experience that was for the nation. We really didn't win, I think, is part of it. It explores those early partisan politics with these horrible newspapers that had all these lies. And in fact, I think a lot of the ideas I explored in this book look a lot like the recent years in the 21st century, where people are screaming at each other. There are questions about control of the National Guard. There are riots and other unhappiness. And the media is very partisan in telling lies, no matter what politics they favor. But I like to point out to people, unlike the early republic, the current vice president of the United States has not gunned down the former secretary of the Treasury in a duel. So we've been through these bad times before, and it can get worse, but it doesn't have to. So I think those are important reasons to look at this book. And also, it looks at those federal versus state relations, which there's a thing that has come back that I never expected to see in my lifetime. The idea of states' rights is sort of coming back. And in fact, Massachusetts will be a pariah state within the nation until 1824 because it refuses to let the president control its militia. And Congress responds to this in a very kind of funny way. They say, okay, if that's the case, then we're not paying for any of your militia used during the war. And Massachusetts has this enormous debt it has to carry from the War of 1812. And it isn't until 1824 when a Jeffersonian gets elected governor in Massachusetts and the legislature says, okay, you know what? The president really is the commander-in-chief of our militia. And President Monroe welcomes Massachusetts back into the nation, essentially. Monroe was a really clever guy. I wish we had another Monroe. He's not the brainiac that Jefferson or Madison was, but he's got a great touch with people. And one of the really clever things he does after the War of 1812 is he travels to New England, including Maine, and there had been a lot of animosity in New England. And it turns out that these rabid Federalists just fall in love with Monroe. And in fact, the rabid Federalist newspaper editors in Boston coined this term the era of good feelings because he's able to mend things just with his presence and personality. And he gets to Maine and he ends up staying in the home of this rabid Federalist judge and has breakfast at his home. And the Federalist judge is so overawed by having the president in his dining room table that he won't sit for the entire meal. He's just sort of agape. And this was a friend of John Adams and a very Boston-centric kind of guy. But Monroe just won him over.
Well, Josh, it's time for the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. Josh, what might have been the long-term consequences for Maine and the broader United States if Maine had not gained its statehood after the War of 1812, but had continued to remain part of Massachusetts? So if Massachusetts still consisted of Maine, what would our history look like?
I don't think it would have been tremendously different, actually, because Maine gets statehood and then proceeds to follow Massachusetts in everything it does. The bigger question is, what would have happened had Massachusetts and New England as a whole attempted to secede from the United States, and had there been a Civil War in 1815? And that's a pretty crazy question because New England might have pulled it off. Certainly, the American army is no great shakes in the War of 1812, and the Canadians and the British managed to hold it off without much effort when it attempts to invade Canada. So I'm not sure that the United States could have retaken Massachusetts. And then you get to this interesting question, well, can the federal government invade a state and say, you will be part of the nation? Abraham Lincoln thought so. So I think Massachusetts and its attempt to secede is the more interesting part of that.
Well, our conversation today really centered on Maine, but Josh, you're also the interim director of the American Merchant Marine Museum in Kings Point, New York. So would you tell us about the American Merchant Marine Museum and how we can visit?
Gladly. I've been interim director of that museum since, I think, 2009. So we are a museum of the American Merchant Marine. So it's maritime history, primarily of the 20th century. And we're in this lovely old mansion that looks over Long Island Sound. We have lovely grounds. And we are part of the United States Merchant Marine Academy, which is a federal service academy whose students wear uniforms and have military discipline. And they are appointed by their congressmen, just like West Point or Annapolis. There are about 1,000 what we call midshipmen there. And we train these young people at federal expense, both men and women, to operate ships. In fact, we were the first federal academy to have women back in 1974. We're also the only federal academy that was never racially segregated, including the Air Force Academy, which wasn't founded until 1948. So we're this very interesting institution. We're on beautiful grounds. We are open to the public and free. We would love to see you. Come see ship models, eat lunch on our patio, take in the view. It's a really neat place.
If we have more questions about Maine statehood or the American Merchant Marine Museum, where's the best place for us to get in contact with you, Josh?
Probably by my email, and I am a federal employee, so my email is very easy. It's smithj@usmma.edu. So USMMA is just short for United States Merchant Marine Academy. Please feel free to email me, and I'd be glad to assist you in any way I'm able.
Joshua Smith, thank you so much for sharing details of your book, Making Maine, with us, and for giving us a glimpse of early Maine history.
Thank you so much. I was very flattered by your invitation, and I hope to hear a lot from people, and thanks again.
The decision Mainers made to leave Massachusetts and become an independent state was consensual between Maine and Massachusetts. By constitutional right, the Massachusetts General Court, or the state legislature, set the parameters of its support for Maine's statehood petition to the United States Congress. And once the Congress received Maine's petition for statehood, it really only debated it after learning that the Missouri Territory also wanted to enter the United States Union. Now, Maine's journey to statehood started in earnest after the American Revolution. As with many places just west and north of the 13 British American colonies turned states, Maine's population swelled as old British restrictions on settlement faded away and Americans began to have more and more children who needed more and more land to settle on. With more people and more needs, it became hard for Mainers to be governed by Boston. The hub was simply too far away to really understand the issues and needs that Mainers faced. Plus, the elite politics of wealthy Boston Federalists never really felt right to most backcountry and coastal Maine residents, who often didn't have enough money or political power to agree and match up with elite Federalist politics. To many Mainers, the more populist politics of the Democratic Jeffersonians made more sense. As Josh related, the story of Maine's journey to statehood reveals a good deal about the evolution of United States government. It shows us how early states exercised and negotiated power with the fledgling federal government, and how the exercise of these powers and who was exercising them often created tensions and conflicts within states, and between states and the federal government. The relationship between the people, the states, and the federal government has often been uneasy. There are always questions, concerns, and opinions about who gets to govern and who gets to wield the power of government. Maine's journey to statehood allows us to glimpse an early chapter in the delicate dance of power sharing and power balance within the United States. Look for more information about Josh, his book, Making Maine, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/384. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so please tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other interesting state histories or statehood stories would you like to explore? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.